Here we go. Today is Sunday, January 22nd, 2017, and this is episode 182 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Hello, Jerry. How are you, kind sir, this fine evening?
Super duper. How are you?
I am doing well. Sunday comes by way too quick, it seems.
Seriously.
But here we are.
Sorry, slow that down, by the way.
I know. Sorry we didn't record last week, by the way.
I know. Well, I was busy moving the site to a new host because the server that I had it on was falling over regularly due to the load. So
wow,
I had to make a move.
And I think we heard some folks were having some weird subscription update issues, but us telling folks to just resubscribe wouldn't be very helpful because if they hear this podcast,
they've already figured it out.
Figured that out.
Right. So for those of you who had problems, I apologize. Those were related to the server move, the RSS feed. There were some move things that didn't go very well. So.
But hey, bigger and better server now.
That's right.
Indeed. And this is a political-free show, so we won't talk about anything else that's been going on this week that, is craziness.
Make InfoSec great again. That's all I'll say. Yep.
And we're not talking about football, which apparently there's some sort of big football thing in Atlanta where you and I both are.
Yeah, that's right.
The
family was upstairs watching that, so...
my entire social media feed right now is politics and sports ball, and I'm just going to hide in my office.
Life is almost not worth living.
But hey, let's do a show.
All right. So just before we get into the show, a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on this show are ours and do not represent those of our employers. So the first story we have tonight comes from Security Week, and the title is Cyber Threat Intelligence Shows Majority of Cybercrime is Not Sophisticated. And, they wrote the title so well, you almost don't actually have to read the article. Right?
Well, that's what we call clickbait, I think. Well, no, because clickbait is sort of that whole, you won't believe number 7.
Right. There's no reason to click on it because you already get the point. So anyway, they're basically, the author here is saying that if you look at the sources of threat intelligence, and I guess this person is some kind of threat analyst with chief security strategist, right?
To be fair, the threat intelligence they're talking really is more kind of like just summary of breach data. It's more like information.
Threat intelligence can be whatever we want it to be.
Ain't that the sad truth?
So anyway, they're saying, despite all of the discussion about, the advanced attacks, people are continuing to be owned by ransomware. And they give a little bit of guidance, which, basically if you set your anti-malware software to scan all email attachments, that will help catch most malicious attachments, which, I'm not sure where this guy's been at, but that's not what I've been seeing. Anyway.
What do you mean that's not what you've been saying? That phishing isn't the start of most breaches?
No, that your anti-malware solution can catch most malicious attachments. Yeah.
Well, to be fair, he does talk about having dedicated anti-phishing capabilities deployed as well.
That's true. That's true.
And to be fair as well, I think where he's going with this is a lot of folks don't think about the fact that like Word documents with macros enabled could be a problem and that sort of thing. So I think this is more a think broader with your border MTA technologies than it is, old school thinking.
Yeah, fair enough.
The way I read it. I mean, but maybe I'm just feeling generous today.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. He does go on to talk about enabling the GPO settings to disable macros in Microsoft Office documents.
Yeah,
So
Office 2016 and Office 2013 both have some really good functionality for that sort of thing.
Yep, and then he goes on to talk about how exploit kits is also a very common problem. Now, exploit kits isn't that's not the end of the line, right? This is more the delivery mechanism. But the point is that most of the exploit kit most of the exploits the exploit kits use. Well, that was a tongue twister. Are old, right? They're not new, and so
they're going after known vulnerabilities that have patches available. They're not
right.
using 0 days.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you keep your stuff patched, you're pretty far ahead of the game with respect to exploit kits.
Yeah, especially things like Flash.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then credential management. Again, no particular surprise there. Obviously, password managers, unique passwords, getting people not to reuse passwords. Although, I suspect, although this is probably going to be changing, right? But a lot of organizations have that, every 90-day password change requirement, and so, I'm not convinced that your LinkedIn password or your eBay password or whatever password got stolen is likely to be one that you've also used at your company because of the requirement to continually change them.
Yeah, agreed. I think that sort of piece of advice is more for non-corporate environment reuse is the way I've seen it. Unless you're in an environment that just doesn't force any password changes at all.
Well, but that was where I was going because the NIST, I'm going to say it right so I don't get any more hate mail, right? NIST.
Oh, you'll still get hate mail, but thanks for saying that right.
That's true. NIST, recently released their updated password guidance and recommends against the 90-day password changes.
Well, and that's something we talked about on the show, I don't know, a couple months ago. Yeah. Some controversy on there where someone was arguing, hey, forcing people to change passwords and rotate passwords leads to weaker passwords, which in a microcosm I get, but that doesn't help you in a world where password databases are getting leaked and cracked. And so you're fixing one problem, but you're opening yourself up to another. Right, you're solving one risk, but incorporating a different risk. So, this goes back to fundamentally, passwords are probably a bad solution, but it's a solution we're struggling with right now. But so I'm still on the camp of at least rotating passwords gives me some chance of when, 9 months from now, my password for LinkedIn gets leaked. It's not the same one I'm using in my corporate environment. Not me personally, but you know what I mean.
Yep. Fair enough. And he does mention password managers, which we're both pretty big advocates of. And actually, he mentions that not only should you invest a password manager for your employees, but you should attempt to license it so they can use it for personal purposes too.
Which I think is a great idea. But when I was reading this article and thinking about this, that's great, except for assuming I'm in a Windows environment with AD, and assuming most of my passwords are tied back into my AD credentials, my initial login to my desktop doesn't necessarily work well with a password manager. I could pull it up on my phone and sort of try to type it as I read it, but it's not the same convenience as once I'm in the operating system and I've got a password manager that I can do copy paste from.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know. I'm almost at add a smart card or a two-factor auth to my initial AD login and then go password manager, and I think I'd feel pretty comfortable with that.
Yep, I would agree. Although that gets interesting with disconnected
it does.
laptops.
It does. And I'm a little ignorant of the current technology of exactly how you go about solving some of those problems, but yeah, absolutely. It's supposedly some of the smart card technologies can work off net. Certainly a two-factor token with some sort of rotating code would have a lot more challenge.
Yep.
But
all right, so extortion is their next big hitter, in which I suppose ransomware really falls kind of into that extortion bucket. But we've seen a lot of this with the was it for DD4S, the DDoS ransom threats, I guess.
Yeah,
and a bunch of other things, and they don't really say here, but there's a lot of, especially in those types of venues, there's a lot of peril in paying up because you end up getting a reputation. Whereas with ransomware, you often have your back against the wall, and in fact, a lot of times it's just kind of opportunistic that you got it in the first place. Some of these bigger extortion campaigns, they're specifically targeting organizations, and you don't want to be the one with the name that pays. So.
Yeah, and who knows? I mean, we've got another story we talk about on tonight's show where some of the ransomware is starting to fight. Gangs are starting to fight amongst themselves, and it might be changing the equation of whether or not it's worth paying.
That's very true.
It's a little foreshadow.
Although that might be a narrow edge case. But and then he talks a little bit about technical debt.
Are you saying I'm narrow?
Yes.
Are you saying my views of things are edge cases? Are you saying I amuse you like a clown? I make you wrong movie. Go on.
Let's see, what's the word? Myopic? Oh yeah, that's the one. So he talks a little bit about technical debt, although I didn't like that the technical debt was really couched in terms of application development, right? I think technical debt can exist in many different contexts in your IT environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would if you read the article, I would keep a little broader perspective on that point. But I think it is a very important point, by the way, that we often get pretty deep in the hole and it's difficult to get out.
Well, I think fundamentally his point is well taken, which is that often we get caught up with the sexy modern edge case threats, of nation state level actors when, we're not getting the basics right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So.
All right. So moving on to our next story, which comes from, actually, we got 3 in a row from Data Breach Today. And the first one is titled "A New In-Depth Analysis of Anthem Breach." So, as you probably remember, back in 2015, it was announced that Anthem had a breach of almost 80 million customer records, and it was attributed to a nation state, which, I think everybody understood as China, or understood to be China, because Mandiant was the one who investigated.
It seems like you're implying something there, Jerry. I don't know what it might be.
Well,
maybe there's a current trend of saying if a nation state was behind your breach, it's a little less bad, because how are you possibly able to defend against a nation state, right?
Well, that's right. And interestingly, despite the severity of this incident, a number of state attorneys general actually launched an investigation into the breach and concluded that it, in fact, was a nation state. They didn't say which one, at least publicly, and I'm going to say they didn't fine or they didn't punish Anthem any more than they had already incurred damage from. So Anthem had incurred about $260 million worth of costs between the forensic costs. They spent $150 million on security improvements, $31 million to notify their customers of the breach, and $112 million to provide credit protection. By the way, I was thinking about that a little bit. So there are 80 million people, $112 million for credit protection. That's like what, $1.20 per person?
Hey, when you buy in bulk, man.
No, I was
thinking I caught the $2.5 million to engage expert consultants.
Oh yeah, that was Mandiant, right? That's
well, I don't know.
Well, they actually say it in here.
Well, I get that Mandiant was part of it, but what I'm saying is that maybe not all of it. I mean, typically Mandiant will do a lot of the initial investigation and recommendations, but often I would imagine, and I'm just guessing here, that $2.5 million is it E&Y or one of the big four consulting firms doing additional work.
Maybe
is
so.
my guess.
Maybe so. If it were E&Y, I'd expect it to be a much bigger number.
But I don't know. I mean, I'm purely speculating there, but I don't think it was just breach investigation and, for 2.5 million. That's wow.
Yeah, fair enough.
If that's true, I'm going into breach investigation.
Yeah,
I would have done it for 2.2 million. Let me just put it that way.
Well, I don't think they really are in the mood to shop around at the. And by the way, that's I think part of the problem with.
No, it's very
these
true.
Incident response companies.
Right. It's when you need an ambulance, you're not going to start price shopping.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So anyway, the net is, it was called a nation state attack. That in the that they effectively, this report from the attorneys general effectively said that Anthem had reasonable security controls in place. They, I think the exact wording, I don't have it in front of me, but was something to the effect of, it was what you would expect companies their size to have in place. So really not a lot of detail about what that is. But they did go on to mention they've made improvements. For instance, they implemented two-factor authentication to get in from remote access. They implemented a privilege management system. They did some type of significant enhancement to their log monitoring. It doesn't really say exactly what they did, but that probably was not cheap. Let's see, what else? What other? They did mention, by the way, that I guess once the breach was detected, they ceased all remote access, which I thought was pretty interesting. Probably a good idea. They mentioned they had.
Well, it depends on the avenue of attack and the way that the bad guy was coming to the door.
Yeah, well, they did say that the initial infection or the initial compromise happened through phishing. Through a phishing attack, which is not surprising at all. And but they did say that they had compromised something like 50 user IDs and then 90 systems, and then they eventually got to a data warehouse. So I don't know, probably something like a.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that shutting down remote access for your employees is helpful if that's the only way the bad guy's coming in. But often, to maintain persistence, as soon as somebody gets in the door, they'll set up some sort of reverse shell that's able to exfiltrate out through your firewalls from the inside, and they can come back over that shell.
Yes.
That tunnel. So anyway,
Yep.
We're doing something. We shut down the remote access.
Well, I have.
Hey, we're doing something. Okay.
It's an interesting thing because and I think you probably have had a similar experience since we've been on the podcast. I've had a number of people over time ask, come to me and say, "Hey, we're completely compromised. What should we do?" And the problem is, this is such a complicated answer. You really have to have someone there who's very familiar with. I mean, I'd love to give you the five. Here's the 5 things you need to go do, right? But that you can't. That's just not reasonable.
Yeah, figure out what they did and undo it.
Figure out where they're coming from,
right,
and shut it down.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated, which is why companies like Mandiant exist. And I mean, we rip on Mandiant, but their employees are incredibly good and strong. We tease Mandiant because of their executives' interest in sort of being part of the blame shifting. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, the political aspect. I mean, I think.
But I have a lot of respect for the guys on the ground at Mandiant. Absolutely,
they have a well-earned reputation.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought was interesting about this, that they talked about was that, you mentioned they had reasonable measures in place, but they found a whole bunch of areas to improve.
Yes.
And they conducted a pen test exercise, which is great. And of course, they talk about the nation state, but quoting from the article, the team determined with a high degree of confidence the identity of the attacker and concluded with a medium degree of confidence that the attacker was acting on behalf of a foreign government. Notably, the exam team also advised that previous attacks associated with this foreign government has not resulted in personal information being transferred to non-state actors. So I thought that was an interesting thing to point out.
Well, I think that the reason I interpreted them specifically calling that out was that the data that was stolen probably wouldn't be used at some point for fraud purposes, for commercial fraud purposes. It was probably more for some. I mean, assuming this story. I mean, let's just go with it, right? Assuming the story that this is that particular nation state actor with that particular motive. The idea being, whoever contracted having that data stolen is going to use it for some kind of intelligence purpose, not to go and get fillings on your insurance. So,
indeed. But some of the takeaways were interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, I kind of want to eat my words a little bit, because I think at some point in the past I've said I'd be really surprised if a HIPAA breach ever was found not to be in compliance with the HIPAA rules, right? And now OCR, as far as I can tell, the Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights doesn't appear like it was part of this investigation, right? So they may have something yet to come, right? But so far, this is kind of going against what I thought we would see,
because of the conclusion that they had adequate and appropriate defenses in place, and it
Correct.
was a nation state. They couldn't have stopped.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, I lost the
which,
quote.
By the way, I don't agree with that sentiment at all. I think, but I think it's very dangerous to start saying, well, there's nothing you could have done because it was a nation state. I think that's dangerous. I think that's a defeatist attitude.
Yeah, I can't find the quote at the moment, but there was a quote in this article that basically said insurers and private industry can't expect to defend against nation states. Governments have to step up,
right,
and defend.
It's here. Quote: insurers and regulators alone cannot stop governments assisting cyber attacks. Cannot stop foreign government assisted cyber attacks. The United States government needs to take steps to prevent and hold foreign governments and other foreign actors accountable for cyber attacks on insurers, much as the president did in response to Russian government-sponsored cyber hacking in our recent presidential election. I get where they're going with that, but that really feels like a lawyery way of saying, we did our best, but there's nobody who could have stood up to this, so don't throw the book at us. I understand, but I still come back to saying the techniques that are used, that we're talking about here, a phishing technique and account compromise and whatnot, are not, and nothing I've seen in this report yet shows me this is exclusively within the domain of a nation-state capability.
No, probably not.
It's not a Stuxnet. It's not a, and this is the type of attack that we see every day that we do have to defend against. So this is dangerous in the sense of throwing your hands up in the air going, well, we're just going to get popped. So, just the way it's going to be. But I think there's also some politics being played here on the flip side of this in terms of don't fine us and, PR and that kind of stuff, which is, layer 8 and 9 level problems.
Yep. That's right. So let's move on to our next story from Data Breach Today, and this one is $475,000 HIPAA penalty for tardy breach notification. So the story here is a company called Presence Health in Chicago lost 8 paper records. So this isn't even electronic records. This is paper records. But I thought it was relevant to bring up for 800 people. Right, so pretty small number. It exceeds the 500 limit, right? So there's a 500 person limit of what's reportable to HHS under the HIPAA rules. 800 people, and they were fined for not reporting within what they call a timely manner, right? So apparently this happened in October of 2013, and this health company notified the Office of Civil Rights on January 31st. And so that was found to be just extraordinarily long, and not within what they call timely notification. So the point I wanted to bring up is that if you have if you operate under the auspices of some regulator, a lot of regulators have this rule now, and even in fact the SEC with public companies has this to some extent, right? It's not quite to this extent, right? But there's a lot of regulations now have a requirement for reporting breaches in a timely manner, and I think we're starting to see these regulators putting some teeth into meeting that requirement. And so the problem here, I think, is that just having been around the industry a long time, companies really like to look at a breach 10 ways from Sunday before they will go and report it.
Sure.
And the problem, I mean, which, by the way, makes sense, right? Because we saw with, I forget which company it was right now, there was a pretty high profile breach of, let's say it was 2 million records, and after some analysis, it was significantly less, right?
Right.
And that's why I think that's why companies really want to understand, and legal counsel will typically provide that guidance. You really want to understand what the actual facts are.
Mm-hmm. Because it's really difficult to unring that bell once you ring it.
Right.
Yep.
But that kind of flies in the face, especially if you have some type of a complicated breach that flies in the face of the mandate to do timely notification.
Yeah, and it could be just because we're covering a couple of these stories commonly, but it really seems like OCR is not playing when it comes to HIPAA violations. They seem quite intense on finding.
They definitely are. Well, I think the thing that changed recently was I think it was end of 2015, maybe early 2016. They passed that new HIPAA mega rule, which basically was a lot of clarification that had always been forthcoming, and they finally provided it. And so now that was the teeth behind HIPAA.
I'm glad I don't work in healthcare. And admittedly, it's an area I'm not a HIPAA expert by any sense of the imagination. That's true. So it's an area I'm a little weak in, but they do seem pretty frequently to be finding people.
Yeah. Yep. And a lot of companies fall in scope of HIPAA. So moving on to our next story. This also again comes from Data Breach Today. Title is Insurer Slapped with $2.2 million HIPAA Settlement. So,
as I was saying.
Yes. So this story here, a Puerto Rican insurance company lost a thumb drive, USB drive, in 2011 with just over 2,000 the records of 2,000 people. So that's huge,
one expensive thumb drive.
It's right, not a huge amount of data, right? But it is a pretty significant find, and here's why, right? I mean, obviously the data wasn't encrypted on the USB drive, otherwise it wouldn't have been a reportable breach. However, the insurance company called Mapfre, I don't know exactly how to say it, MAPFRE, apparently had made some assertions to the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, about where they were at with their HIPAA control program, and they actually weren't there. They didn't meet their commitments. They didn't have controls in place that they had said. They apparently hadn't performed the mandated risk assessments and implemented the finding, the corrective actions from those risk assessments, and so on and so forth. And so because of all of that, OCR is fining them $2.2 million. So I would say that this is kind of like the last one. These are relatively small breaches, and in the absence of, kind of I'm not going to call it malfeasance, right? But just not being on top of the ball, right? They're getting fined, right? So,
Yeah.
and this again goes to, if you are part of a regulated industry and your regulator says, you need to do X by Y date, or you go to them and you say, I'm going to do X by Y date. Well, you damn well better do it.
Yeah, they're serious. They mean it. Yeah, so this is interesting because at the end of the day, this fine is because they did not put in place fast enough what they said they were going to do.
On the timeline. And I don't know. I am not that familiar with the OCR as much as I am with other regulators, but they probably would have done well to keep them updated on what their plans were.
Well, it could also be that potentially the company might have maybe, I don't know, lied.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but if you read between the lines, that's
right. Either way, what they said they were going to do and the time they were going to do it, they got caught not doing,
right,
for whatever reason.
Right. Don't do that.
2.2 million. Now, what's interesting, though, is think about this for a moment. Is that really ultimately solving the problem? I mean, it sends a message to somebody else. But for this particular company, that 2.2 million is probably going to come out of somebody's budget. And would that money have been better spent on actually implementing better controls? I don't know. And that's a whole different debate for a different day. And I certainly don't want the OCR mandating, fines to be spent on, cybersecurity solutions. That's all sorts of pain. But it's an interesting question, right? Because the problem was they didn't do what they were supposed to do in a certain period of time. It could have been budgetary. Could have been they just weren't convinced this was an issue. Could have been somebody didn't have the right staff. Who knows, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons things don't get done.
Yep.
And now they've got 2.2 million less to do it with.
That's right. Which ultimately will probably be passed on to their customers.
Well, indeed. How else would they?
Yeah, it's very unlikely to come out of the shareholders. just saying.
It's true.
So next up is from Krebs on Security, and the title here is "Extortionists Wipe Thousands of Database Victims Who Pay Get Stiffed." So this is actually been banging around the internet for a couple of years now, right? And here's the story: there's these crazy NoSQL databases like MongoDB and some others are growing in popularity, but why
do you say they're crazy?
Well, I'll explain why they're crazy, right? They're crazy because they are they're pretty simplistic, right? And one of the reasons people really like setting them up is that not only are they fairly powerful in what they can do, and they're easy to set up, but one of the reasons they're so easy to set up is they often have, particularly by default, pretty weak permissions, right? And so what ends up happening and has happened an unfortunate number of times, especially in the context of like cloud computing, companies are setting these databases up in let's say AWS or Azure or name your cloud provider, and filling it up with data to do some kind of analysis on, and unaware that the database is just kind of out there flapping in the wind, right? That anybody who connects to it can have their way with it. Well,
so this is like the database equivalent of Chinese IoT devices.
Very much so. Very, very much so. Right. And so what's happened over time, and I mean, I think it was Chris Vickery was the guy who was looking at this 6 or 8 months, or maybe even a year ago. He was running around chasing after MongoDB. Anyway, these databases are pretty easy to find on Shodan, right? You can look them up and you can kind of see the types of tables that are connected.
The vulnerable databases are easy to find, not just the database himself. You can very quickly figure out which ones are vulnerable.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so the thing that happened here was, and the reason this has come to light was somebody was kind of trolling Shodan and just doing their normal trolling, looking for these MongoDB instances, and noticed that most of them, the actual tables were kind of all being consistently, they were all consistently named. Like before, apparently they were all sorts of different names based on however the person set it up, but now they all contained like one of 3 or 4 different things, like readme, important, or I forget the file names. But anyway, the person looked at those and found that they're ransom notes, with an email address, Bitcoin address, and a ransom demand. And apparently, I think I don't know exactly how many there were, but there were 52,000 publicly accessible MongoDB databases on the internet, according to Shodan. And as far as we know, most of those have actually been ransomed. And I mean,
unrelated to this particular story, or at least not in this story, somebody else on Twitter was saying that they popped one of these up, and the time to live was 18 hours before it got popped.
Wow. So it's probably some kind of automated attack. But what's interesting is, and kind of like the title of the story says, people whose data is being encrypted or actually stolen. Apparently, what's happening is the attackers are downloading the data, right? So they're copying the data off of the database, and then they actually just delete it, right? So they're not encrypting it in place; they're just deleting it. You don't have the data anymore. They leave a file with information to get it back. But what's happening is there's multiple actors in play, right? And so I come along and I erase Bob's MongoDB and I leave a love note, right? And then you come by later, erase my note and leave your own, because your tool is just automated and it just deletes my stuff and puts your own stuff. And now the person who Bob doesn't know who, he goes to you and you're like, can't help you.
But give me the ransom first anyway.
But right. But
exactly.
But you don't know that. Nobody knows that until you try to pay, right? And so these people are being stiffed, right? And by the way, it's not entirely clear, even if your system hadn't been compromised by multiple actors in succession, if you would get the data back anyway, right? There's as far as we can tell, there's been very few, if any, of these victims that have actually been able to get their data back despite having paid. And this is one of those cases where we've really got to get our head around the new technology, right? That the new sexy technology that people are deploying, and MongoDB again is one of those where it's super easy, really lightweight. You don't have to be a DBA to set it up, and so,
which, by the way, is supposedly the promise of computing.
Well,
to make it easier and more accessible, and
it absolutely is. But we have to understand the problem with that, right?
I do. I agreed. So, is it someone incumbent upon the MongoDB, source code folks to say, "Hey, let's add you must change your default password." First, log into it first time. I don't know. I mean,
well, that's what we're seeing. I mean, if you think about it in the context of the cheap Chinese webcams and stuff, right? That's kind of how that's being addressed.
Yeah, but it's such a point solution to it. I guess what I'm saying is that we fundamentally still aren't baking this sort of thought process into all of our development. It's often like we're after a bunch of stuff gets owned, we solve that particular point problem. We're treating the symptom, not necessarily the disease, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Exactly right. We need a process that vets this, vets new technology that we want to use and figures out, okay, what's the right safe deployment model for this?
Well, I mean, are we going back to the county password inspector who's going to help with that? I mean,
no, I think it's up. I mean, unfortunately, as it stands, it's kind of up to each organization to figure that out for themselves. I mean, the county password inspector is. I mean, I'm just saying.
Well, I guess why I'm struggling with this is it's sort of that whole. I don't want a centralized government-run solution to this problem.
No,
You know?
I don't either. But this again, I think, is why organizations have to have standards, right?
Right.
And you know, most organizations should probably have a standard that says, you're a database. Because one of the victims, by the way, and it's not in this story, it was reported several weeks ago. It was some kind of cancer institute, and it was a bunch of cancer-related, research that was in a database, and apparently, I guess, had no backups, and got deleted, and and there was a terrible, horrible tragedy, right? But again, this is why we have to have standards, right?
Agreed, but the upside and the downside of these being so easy to deploy is that you're probably going to see this pop up more and more as shadow IT.
You're absolutely right, and I'm sure this is actually what's going on, right? I would bet you the preponderance of these are shadow IT.
IT security gets in the way with all their silly standards, and we just need to get this up this week and let's get it going. Come on, we got stuff to do.
Wait,
no, I'm serious. I mean,
you're right, but put it behind a firewall. I mean,
why? That means I've got to file more paperwork and wait for them to approve it. I can go to Amazon and have it up in 20 minutes.
Put it behind an Amazon firewall. Right? I mean, we gotta
look. You expect me to know security, man? I'm just a guy trying to get my job done.
We can either solve this, or we're gonna keep having our databases deleted.
I agree. But I'm being intentionally difficult because this is what I think is exactly what's happening.
It is what's happening.
But
the people who are setting this up are not going to security. They are. I mean, I think the average company thinks of the cloud as the policy-free zone.
Sure.
Right. Like, well, crap. We don't have to deal with those assholes in IT security.
Right.
And get our crap in the data center. We're just going to slap our credit card down and buy some Amazon, and off we go.
Because in the past, the fundamental way to control this was the firewall.
Right.
And you still had to get through the firewall if you wanted to stand up a new service. So that was always the last sanity check. That doesn't exist anymore when we have this easy cloud infrastructure.
Right.
And I think this is, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. And I think we're going to talk about it today too. We are going through a massive shift in how we're going to look at security as a result of this. It is way too easy from a security standpoint to stand up shadow IT right now. But that's excellent for companies in the short term. Right. It's excellent for quote unquote productivity in the short term.
Right.
So, and I think this trend is going to continue. And it's probably going to get uglier before it gets better.
The trend certainly seems to be slanted in that direction. Yes, absolutely.
And the only way I know to fight this is really, really strong culture, where your security team has to be deeply integrated into all the different groups and be approachable and be useful and reasonable and helpful.
Facilitative, right? Yes.
Yeah. And have executives really buy into that.
Yeah, I honestly think we as security people. I know I mentioned this on the past show, but this is an example where I think we really have to get much more attuned to the drivers behind the cloud, behind the push to cloud, right, and figure out kind of like how cloud is revolutionizing how IT works. Mm-hmm. We've got to revolutionize how security is done. I don't know what that means, right? But I don't know that the traditional model of infosec and firewalls and analysis and all that crap is kind of incompatible with this whole concept, and so we've got to figure that out. And if we don't figure it out, this is going to be the result.
Yep. And the challenge there is that not only do we need to figure it out and adapt, but we've got to do both at the same time. We've got to continue doing what we're doing today and somehow do double duty to figure out that model too.
Right.
Because both are going to exist.
That orchid farm looks really attractive right now.
I think this is going to be a topic on this show for years to come because I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg on this. I think this is the start of this transition.
Absolutely.
And this was sort of the concept way back in the day that Microsoft pitched was every computer can be its own server. Bob in accounting can be part of IT now, right? And Susie in marketing can set up her own SharePoint server,
right?
And share information. We're now extending that to the cloud.
Yeah.
But the scary part is we facilitated this concept of self-service of IT inside the firewall. Now this concept is being perpetuated raw on the internet.
Well, right, because I think there's a lot of simultaneous changes happening, right? We're also moving towards the concept of zero trust, right? Well, once you those two concepts of self-enablement and zero trust, I'm not going to say they're incompatible. I think they're incompatible as they exist today in large measure.
So it's almost like as data is created, that's where you're going to have to secure it with really strong rights management or something.
Yep.
I don't think that's the answer, but it's something like that. Yeah. Anyway, we should get on to our last story.
So this actually kind of fits very well. The last story we have, this is actually the next episode in the thing we talked about last time from Securosis. They're doing this series on the fundamental changes in IT, in particular moving into cloud. And the title of this week's post is Tidal Force's Endpoints Are Different, More Secure, Less Open. And when you read through this, hopefully none of these points are earth-shattering, right? But when you think about them all together, it's a really interesting picture that we're going to have to kind of rationalize. And so the point is, as knowledge workers, I mean, not even as IT people, but just as knowledge workers, most people spend a lot more time with their phone and their iPad or tablet than they do with a traditional PC. And they point out that there was in 2016 there were 260 million PCs shipped compared to 1.5 billion smartphones shipped. And they say that in 2017 the expectation is there'll be more Apple operating systems than Windows installations, which is a huge. I mean, that's massive. That's massive, and that has some pretty interesting implications because, as Apple is, on the one hand, Apple has had, to its credit, a pretty good run of security. Now I'm not going to say on Mac OS, right? But that's more, I think, coincidental. But especially in iOS, they've done a pretty good job. That could change tomorrow. Not going to lie, right? But their point is, these devices are inherently more secure than our PCs, right? And one of the reasons,
and that's intuitive because of the fact that they are purpose-built machines with limited customization capability. When we talk about a PC with a modern OS, it's meant to be incredibly versatile.
Right.
It has the full instruction set at any time available to it.
Right.
And any piece of code who knows how to talk to it can talk to it.
And so then they contrast that with the fact that because of what we just mentioned, they're by definition not open platforms.
Right.
And so in the case of Apple, for instance, they pick on Apple a lot. Apple views, the types of access you would need to run antivirus and other things like that as a security risk. And so you're not going to get your antivirus on Apple, and that's going to inhibit.
You're trusting the OS.
Correct.
To a great degree.
Right. So their point, their net point here is that you're going to have, as IT departments, you're going to have devices that are more secure, typically on average than our PCs, but you're going to have a lot less insight.
Yeah, less control.
And then they go on to talk about, similarly with networks, the push to TLS has made many of the traditional tools go dark, unless you're doing man in the middle, and that, by the way,
is about to be a bigger problem because of the push to perfect forward security.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, which for those who may not know what that is, it's worth looking up, but it's basically a type of, I'm going to get yelled at for this. It's a method of configuring TLS so that interception and man in the middle is not possible in theory. So that has great implications on a good side and a bad side. It's good because then somebody can't man in the middle your SSL session, but the bad side is corporate IT can't man in the middle of the session either to apply anti-malware or DLP or whatever it may be.
Yeah. I always thought, and I could be wrong, I always thought perfect forward secrecy was if you recorded it and you obtain a key from early in the session, you wouldn't be able to decrypt. But anyway, I could be.
Might be right.
I'm out of my element a little bit there. So.
Yeah, I mean, no, you're on the right. Okay, so it's a secure communication protocol which compromise long-term keys, do not compromise past sessions. Yes, but somehow that also breaks
the ability to do the man in the middle. Okay.
I mean, I could be. Oh, now I feel stupid. Hang on.
Don't worry, I'll edit it out. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, so this is interesting. I may have some bad info on this. The reason that this was coming up is that I understood this is that there's a push to use Diffie-Hellman type keys,
right?
Which
they make the mayonnaise, right?
Yes, that's right. Which I understood was enabling perfect forward secrecy. But maybe this is two things going on at the same time. Because when you push the Diffie-Hellman for your TLS, it makes interception impossible, is what I understood. Okay. It protects you from man-in-the-middle attacks. So okay. So full disclosure, I may be screwing this up for everybody on the show, and I'm sorry. So my advice is worth exactly what you pay for it. So do your own research on this. But the reason I was looking at this is because, in terms of like a WAF or in terms of like a proxy or reverse proxy, when you do Diffie-Hellman keys, you blind that technology. Because it can't, unless you're terminating the connection at that point, and then re-encrypting back to whatever the browser or the server is. In essence, you can't intercept it on your security technologies with the Diffie-Hellman key. Now, for some reason, I thought that was called perfect forward secrecy, and I may be mixing up a couple of things here.
Okay.
But the point still stands.
Yeah.
We're moving to a technology that's very, very difficult to inspect with security technology unless you terminate at that device and re-encrypt, as opposed to just decrypting and letting it re-encrypt and go on. Yeah.
Now, I will also tell you, in addition to being difficult, right? Not to mention, by the way, well, there's a few things, right? There is a fundamental problem a lot of IT people have with this. There, if you were to think of like Venn diagram wise, the Uber privacy people and information security people, right? There's a big overlap.
Right.
And
we get a lot of feedback when we talk about this because a lot of people are like, why are you inspecting corporate traffic anyway? You shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's unethical.
But okay. But look at it from a security technology standpoint. All this technology we've wrapped into network inspection gets blinded with TLS.
Right. And so your your DLP, right, can't see
Mhm.
inside a TLS tunnel, right? And so that's a problem if you
And in certain environments, regulatorily, that's a problem.
right. Now,
Yeah.
but there is a technical, and I had some good discussions with some people about this. There are other problems that don't come up here, right? Because uh, i- in line with all of this push to the cloud and to SaaS and whatnot, where do you perform that at now, right?
Right. That's a
So
great point.
you know, in the traditional model of where you had, you know, your data center was in the next room, your people were in this room, you know, you had an internet connection coming into your building, and you could, you know, you had a clean place to look at that. Well, it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, but I guess there's still a kind of a throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? You know, where are your users? That's probably where you want to be looking at the traffic. So,
On the way out. Wrapping back to our first point, just for a moment, about how the endpoints are becoming less open and move to the cloud. The other thing that's interesting to me is that even though the endpoints are more secure, there is a security implication of opening up that data to those devices. In terms of,
yeah, yep,
you may be exposing the data. You may be opening your attack surface wherever the source of that information is that those devices are accessing, because always on need to be able to get to it. I mean, I can't tell you how often I talk to executives who have a nice little app on their iPad that gives them real-time data about something that they love and want, and they don't want the trouble of standing up a VPN to get to it when they're in front of a customer. Just make it be there. Right, which is, I get it. That makes perfect sense from an executive standpoint, and and that is the way we are going as an entire industry and as a culture. But now that means that there's a security implication that data is now more easily accessible. And how do you protect it transparently without adding friction to the interaction with that data? On the go, anywhere, always on.
simple.
Raise orchids.
Yep, raise orchids. That's right. So then they move on to some shifts that we're likely to see in the marketplace, which, if from a vendor perspective, they point out that there's going to be a very large contraction in consumer anti-malware protection, right? So as more of us move to iPads and iPhones and fewer Windows 10 laptops, there's going to be less opportunity for Symantec to get on, or McAfee, or I guess it's Intel now, to get on your device, right? And they even point out that with Windows 10, antivirus, there's a native antivirus that's, respectable. I guess it's not great, but the net point is this is going to be a market that's going to dry up for these companies. And so they point out that this is probably why we're seeing some odd acquisitions like Symantec buying LifeLock.
Right.
Where they
because that's the default breach response, by the way, is here, have some credit monitor.
It is. Yes, it is.
Though LifeLock is probably the most expensive of the offerings. So
right.
Of all the breaches I've been involved with, I've never been offered LifeLock protection.
Nope, me either. The next one was endpoint security vendors will see some reduction in enterprise sales, and again, a similar move as more of these embedded devices become common, that there'll be less opportunity, but also as free tools like OS Query, they mentioned specifically, gain prominence and maturity, and also the operating systems themselves are starting to move into this place. The traditional security companies, enterprise security companies, are going to have less opportunity to sell. And then they basically, the bad news is, for the network box vendors, the firewall VPN type IPS type providers, they basically said those guys are in trouble.
Well, they'll have to pivot to a different model if they can.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what what that moves to. And then they talk about some practice changes related to endpoint security. So they mentioned this a little bit ago. Security will be better, but monitoring will be harder, right? Again, for the reasons we talked about. We won't need it to manage as many endpoint tools. Again, because presumably we'll be moving into more of a homogeneous type environment, which, by the way, has its own problems, right? There are some problems with that. We'll move to zero trust networks, which, if you're not familiar with zero trust networks, there's a lot, not a ton written, but there's some stuff written. I think this is definitely something to brush up on if you're not familiar with it. Understand what it is and start thinking about it. And then also we will use more cloud-based network monitoring and filtering. To be candid, I don't understand how that works.
Are you implying you haven't been candid up until this point?
Yes. I've been lying this entire time.
The way I read that is that cloud providers will offer that as add-on services in some way, shape, or form.
Right, but
built into their technology. But
built into what technology?
Well, to the cloud, the magic cloud. No, okay, so you want DLP. Okay, that's a module you can add on to whatever container you're spinning up that's processing information, and that's so that DLP is looking past the decryption point on the way in.
Yeah,
I don't
know. I'm sure that's what the intention is, but again, if the assumption is that each of these endpoints is kind of an island,
marketers are going to market, man. If there's
you're right about that.
If there's a business model, they'll offer it. Now, whether it's good or not is a different question.
What I don't understand about this point is how you get all of the traffic that needs to be inspected to go through the cloud service. That's what I don't understand. And so maybe you end up with...
it would have to be where the data lives.
Right. But sometimes the data's going to live on your phone.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying. So I was sort of looking at it from a data server-centric viewpoint, right? I'm standing up a server. I'm standing up a data access.
So Amazon's going to provide some kind of DLP for you.
Right.
Right. But that's a kind of a narrow use case that is.
Once again, you're implying I'm narrow with my use cases.
Well, no, that use case is narrow.
Well, so otherwise, cloud proxy, cloud, I don't know, bounce all your traffic through North Korea.
Yeah, that could work. Well, I think I'm at bedrock in this one right now.
I think it's late on a Sunday. We're both tired, so
yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it for this week. We should be back next week, right? Because I'm not intending to do any crazy stuff with the hosting providers again. So hopefully they weather the storm that is about to come in a few hours.
What, all 30 of our listeners?
Yeah, downloading over and over and over again. Yes. So just a reminder, I want to thank everybody who has donated to our Patreon campaign.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
And if you like the show, give us some love on iTunes, please. That makes it all worthwhile to wake up in the morning and look at iTunes and see some new reviews, especially if they're good. You can send us an email if you have any ideas, concerns, comments, feedback, info@defensivesecurity.org. You can find links to all the stories we talked about today on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the show on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Callett on Twitter at Lurg and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And with that, we will talk again next week.
Have a great week, everybody. Thanks as always for listening. See ya.
Take care. Bye-bye.